Thank you. Sir, thank you so much for joining us at India Economic Conclave 2021, and sorry to keep you waiting. My first question is basically about the recovery that we have seen in Indian economy. Does this mean we are back on track? Is this the beginning of the much-awaited Indian recovery or the economic recovery that everybody has been hoping for? Is that your view?
Well, it's a matter of enormous comfort that India has recovered from the crisis caused by the pandemic. The recovery has come much sooner, and also that the downturn has been less deep than we feared. If you throw your mind back to last year around this time, indeed, even as recently as 6 months ago, we were concerned about the economy contracting by 10% or even 15%. Now we're told that the contraction this year is going to be 8%, which is bad, but comforting relative to 15%. Next year, we're told that there's going to be a rebound. Estimates for growth next year from anywhere from 11 to 11.5% of the government and RBI to 13.5 to 14% of investment banks and many analysts. But there are two concerns we must acknowledge. The first is that even as there's going to be a rebound next year, the economy has been slowing even before the pandemic. If you throw your mind back 5 years, 4 years ago, the economy grew at 8%, 3 years ago at 7%, 2 years ago at 6%, last year at 4%, this year contraction of 8%, next year a rebound of 13.5 or 14% on a low base. So at the end of next fiscal year, FY 21-22, the economic output will still be low compared to the pre-pandemic growth output. So we would have lost some growth on a permanent basis. The first point is, as much as the recovery is comforting, there is going to be permanent loss of output. And the second concern, and possibly a more important concern, is that the economic crisis in the wake of the pandemic has accentuated inequalities. We talk about a V-shaped recovery, actually it's a K-shaped recovery. The upper segment of the population has indeed experienced a V-shaped recovery. They've seen increase in their incomes have been protected or indeed have gone up. Their wealth has gone up because of asset price inflation, so they're experiencing a positive income and wealth effect. On the other hand, the bottom half of the population has seen loss of incomes, loss of jobs, loss of purchasing power because of inflation, loss of their savings, so they're experiencing a negative income and wealth effect. This inequality is bad, is morally wrong, of course, is socially and politically corrosive, but it's also economically negative. Right. So we have to be aware and deeply sensitive to this consequence of the crisis.
Right. Sir, I have a quick follow-up question on that. Now, in that case, are we looking at a scenario where we'll have to wait for some time before we actually get into 9% plus kind of growth trajectory?
Oh, certainly. It will take some time for the economy to go to 9+%. It's not unknown to us. We had the India growth story from 2003 to 2008 when the economy clocked growth of 9+%. And that was driven by investment. So if you look at that data at that period, investment grew year on year about 11%, and investment as a proportion of GDP went up as high as 38%. So to get investment back on track is certainly going to take time. In fact, a consequence of the pandemic has been that the potential growth rate has come down. We thought it was 7%, it's now maybe 6% or even 5.5%. Right. So to get from 5.5% potential growth rate at the moment to 9% is going to take time. We can get there, it's possible, but it's going to take time.
Right. Now, sir, as you are aware, the theme for this year's India Economic Conclave is that this decade can belong to India if we reform, perform, and transform. The government has embarked upon a much ambitious program of Atman, bharat. Do you think that is something which can deliver this decade for India, Atman, bharat?
You must allow me a considered response to that because I'm still trying to figure out what Atmanirbhar means. When the finance minister delivered the Atmanirbhar package last summer, it was a combination of fiscal stimulus, some reform intentions, and some policy slogans. In the event, we are still trying to decipher what Atmanirbhar is. If it means self-sufficiency, going back to import substitution is an absolute no. We don't want to go back and do that. If it means self-reliance, which is producing what we can best produce to our comparative advantage and importing what we do not have comparative advantage in, that's good. And if it means self-confidence that India can grow become an economic engine, is good. So self-sufficiency, no. Self-reliance, self-confidence, yes. For India to clock that 9+% growth that you talked about earlier and to deliver on Atmanirbhar Bharat, we need to grow exports. No emerging economy has clocked growth of 7+% without exports. Even the India growth story we talked about 2003 to 2008 came on the back of exports. There's a lot of export pessimism now, thinking that, look, because of Trump tariffs and because of the pandemic, protectionism, export market has shrunk. But you must remember that the global export market is $18 trillion. India's share is only about 1.7%.
That's true.
As Arvind Panagaria says in his book, even if, let's say, the export market shrinks by, let's say, $2 trillion, if it becomes from 17 trillion to 15 trillion, even then, it will be relatively easy for India to double its share in global exports, say from 1.7% to 3.5 or 4%. That can be an enormous force multiplier for India. So even in a scenario when the export market might be shrinking, which is not clear that it is actually shrinking, but even if the export market is shrinking, I believe India still has a comparative advantage in producing for, of course, the domestic market, but also for the global markets.
Right. I have a question. This year, the other thing which is, I think, clearly on the radar for the government is privatization. Now, there are different views. There is a section which believes that this is like selling the family silver. The other section believes that government has no business being in the business. What is your view?
Yes. Well, the Prime Minister said that the government must reduce its share in actual business and must actually provide an environment for the private sector to come in. And quite hearteningly, the narrative starting this budget has shifted from disinvestment to privatization. Since you raised this question, I might also respond to this. A lot of people have said that this amounts to selling away family silver. I don't think so. The government, our own government, previous governments in the early years of independence, invested heavily in public sector. Prime Minister Nehru called investment in public sector and public sector units temples of modern India. There was rationale, there was logic at that time for the government to invest in public sector, for the government to be in business, because there was no private capital, there was no private entrepreneurship. The government had to lead the way and build commanding heights of the economy. But now the private sector has developed, the financial sector has developed, there is private capital, there is private entrepreneurship, and the government must yield space for private business. And it is not selling away silver, because when the government privatizes its assets, it is investing in infrastructure which expands the production base. It's investing in education and health, which improves the productivity of the economy, which are very important. So I would say that privatization is a route for putting India on a sustainable growth path, and privatization is converting one form of silver into another form of silver. I don't believe that it is selling away family silver.
Right. I will now refer to the much talked about theory of demographic dividend. And everybody has been talking about it. India is one of the youngest country in the world. As far as workforce is concerned, we have a median age of about 29 or so. Do you really believe in demographic dividend theory? Or could it become a demographic challenge as well?
I believe in theory, but not the practice. I'm old enough to understand this or to realize this, that over the last several decades, until even 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, we used to look upon our excess population as a burden, as a problem, that even as government is putting in a lot of development effort, it's being negated by huge population growth. That narrative has changed over the last 10 years. We've come to look upon our population as actually a positive. The theory is based on demographic dividend. The theory is that India has a young population, median age of about 29. So these young people will get into the labor market, they will earn, they will consume, they will save part of that. That saving will convert to investment, investment will convert to production, to jobs and growth, and back to more consumption and back to more jobs, and India can get around to a virtuous cycle. That's the theory of demographic dividend. But the important point is this: we're not going to be able to exploit the demographic dividend unless we're able to provide jobs. And there I think we have a very, very big challenge and a big task to perform. So yes, demographic dividend is possible in theory, but it's not inevitable. It's plausible, but not inevitable.
Now, sir, because we live in a federal structure and it's a democracy, and clearly, I mean, all the sessions that we have had since morning, one view is very clear that the next decade is going to be almost a make or break decade for India. Now, in a structure like ours, in a democracy like ours, do you think center can deliver on reforms and growth without cooperation from states?
The one-word answer to your question is no. The central government by itself cannot deliver on growth and development without the cooperation of states. We've seen that over the last 15 years. GST, it required not just the consent but cooperation of the states. Foreign investment, not just consent but cooperation of states. Today, farm law reform, land reforms, labor reforms, they cannot be implemented without the cooperation of states. These reforms that we have to undertake now, the second generation reforms, are distinct from the first generation reforms of 1991. I was part of those reforms, so I can throw my mind back to that period when we dismantled the license permit regime, removed import curbs, foreign exchange controls, etc. It was done in a matter of weeks. And it could be done entirely by the central government. Indeed, it could be done entirely by the South Block Prime Minister's Office, North Block Ministry of Finance, under Jog Bhavan, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Even the other wings of the government of India were not consulted. Those blitzkrieg reforms could be done by Government of India, by a few select ministries in Government of India. But today's second generation reforms need the active cooperation, consent of states, and Government of India cannot do this by itself. And nobody could be more aware of this than Prime Minister Modi, who was Chief Minister of Gujarat for 15 years. So he knows that a Chief Minister can deliver much more than a Prime Minister can deliver from Delhi.
If you were to meet Mr. Modi today, or let's say you have a meeting with him, a short meeting, quick one, what would be your advice to him?
It will be presumptuous on my part to advise the Prime Minister, particularly from a public platform like this. And the Prime Minister is certainly not handicapped for advice. There are very many people giving him sound advice, both from within the government and from outside. But since you ask, if I were to advise the Prime Minister, I would say, go back to Bill Clinton's 1992 election campaign when he said 4 words: is the economy stupid? So if I meet the Prime Minister, I will say, Prime Minister, sir, it's the economy. Your mandate, your job is to accelerate the growth rate and make sure that the benefits of growth go to the bottom half of the population. You must focus on the economic agenda to the exclusion of all other concerns. That and that alone will secure your place in history, will secure your legacy. That would be my advice to the Prime Minister.
Right. I'll ask you my last question, sir. Because you mentioned about the role that the government can play in actually accelerating growth, RBI also has a role to play. And obviously, there has been a lot of discussion about this whole strategy around targeting inflation. As we enter into the new decade, you think this targeting inflation continuously is going to work if India really has to make it in the top 3 economies of the world by 2030?
Yes, it's a very involved question, but I believe that inflation targeting has worked. If you'd actually asked me last year around this time if inflation targeting has worked, I would probably have given a qualified response. I would have hedged my response and said that inflation targeting has not been tested yet. But over the last 1 year, in the wake of the economic crisis of the pandemic, inflation targeting has been tested. Growth had slumped to an all-time low. Inflation has actually ruled above the tolerance band of the RBI for several weeks, indeed several months. But in spite of that, the RBI has interpreted the inflation targeting framework quite flexibly to support recovery, to support growth, and at the same time keeping an eye on inflation. So I believe inflation targeting is not necessarily the best option, but in the Indian situation, it has delivered in the past. And looking ahead, I hear a view that inflation targeting militates against growth. People who say that actually take a very short-term view of the growth-inflation dynamic, growth-inflation tension. But if you take a medium-term view, there is indeed no tension between growth and inflation. Low and steady inflation contributes to sustainable growth as it allows consumers and investors to make informed decisions. So I believe inflation targeting has worked well, and we must stay with it, and it's going to work well in the period ahead.
Right, sir. So thank you so much for taking out time and speaking to us. In our next edition of India Economic Conclave, we hope to have you physically, hopefully with vaccine. That will happen soon. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir, for that inspiring session. Ladies